Welcome. My name is Paul Murphy. I'm one of the profs over in the School of Optometry, so I'm lost as well. I don't know where this building is. North side of Columbia. Here I am, lost in the South Campus. But it's a pleasure to be here, and it's delightful to see so many of you here. I'm one of the committee members for the Pascal lecture series, so I have the pleasure of welcoming you tonight. Maybe you were here last night and down in Hagey Hall to hear our speaker talk about the music that he has created. We're going to hear something more tonight as part of the Pascal lecture series. Pascal lecture series is an interesting thing in that it was established about 40 years ago by the university's executive board to help with that tricky thing, which is sort of the connection between the university and sort of the world around us. Universities are very good at generating knowledge and thinking about things and teaching and education and research and so on. Sometimes the sharing of that knowledge is sometimes tricky. And yet each of us is a person, each of us is involved in our own personal way with knowledge and with understanding. And so the idea of the Pascal lectures is to bring individuals who have something to share with us about their experience between that interface, between their own personal knowledge and experience and what they have done as in sort of the scholarly academic world. And over the years, we've had many different speakers come to share with us their own thoughts and own ideas. And we're fortunate this week to have with us Dr. Donald Knuth, comes from Stanford University, known as the father of computing science in North America. So a great legacy in terms of his understanding of what he has contributed in computing science to the world and to us individually. You're all using computers, you're all enjoying the benefits of an iPhone, something like that. Computing science is really helpful and important to how we live our lives. And yet, as an individual, that person has other things that bring into their attitude and the way they're dealing with computer science. So that's what we're here to enjoy and hear tonight, something further from our speaker, Dr. Knuth. Before I do that, there's a few other things I just want to draw your attention to, and hopefully you received one of these little leaflets just to guide you through. This is just a kind of a highlight sheet of why we're here. The front page tells us a little bit about yesterday's event and tonight's, but also of one other event which is being held on Sunday in the First United Church in Waterloo, that's Uptown Waterloo, and it's a presentation of Dr. Knuth's piece, Fantasia Apocalyptica. If you hear, last night you heard something more about how that piece of music was created, and I hope tonight we'll hear something more about all of that. But there's a chance for you to hear it for yourself. It's the North American premiere, so it's a real unique opportunity to share in something which brings together both computing science and music together. So there's an opportunity still for tickets for that. You need to contact the First United Church, and there's a telephone number on the sheet which gives you information about that. Also at the back we have some books for sale which might be of interest to you. Some of them are from previous Pascal lectures, speakers who came, shared, and then those lectures were transcribed. And there's two pieces there. There's one by Dr. Charles Malik called A Christian Critique of the University, and a second one by Joseph Piper on leisure, the basis of culture. So if those are things that interest you, those are available. There's also a book written by Dr. Knuth alongside Dwayne Bibby, who created a series of illustrations based around the same concept. So Fantasia Apocalyptica is based on the book of Revelation, which is the last book in the Bible, and Dwayne Bibby was inspired as well to consider how he could share his thoughts on that as an artist, and created a series of art pieces that go alongside that. So there is a book available at the back which shares and brings together those two components, the music and the art that goes alongside that. Okay, you've heard enough from me, so I'm going to pass over instead to Dr. Knuth, who's very glad to have you here again. And this format for this evening is really a kind of a combination of discussion and questions. Okay, so the real opportunity for you to come and ask questions as we go along. Dr. Knuth will sort of guide us as to when that's going to happen. You can see I stole one of the microphones from here. There's a second microphone over there. Please come down to the front and ask your question at the microphone, partly because that helps us all to hear. It's hard to hear if I take the microphone away. It doesn't work quite so well. It's a little easier when I have it in front of me. Same thing applies to you. So come down to the front, and it also helps us because we are, as you can see, recording the talk, so this way we can hear what your question is. So without much further ado, I present Dr. Knuth.
The first thing I want to say is that I see more than 6 excellent seats in the front here, and I see people way in the back. And so if you're not really too embarrassed, I would suggest coming up here, because I always give better answers to questions if I see more people in the front row. In computer science, we say it's actually exponentially better. So please come down. There's great seats here. Then I want to, the main thing is I want to customize what I say tonight to what you want to hear. And so I'm going to try to answer maybe not one question a minute, but what you want to, if there's something that you would like to ask me, probably somebody else has the same question too in their mind, so don't be afraid to ask it, and then I'll try to make an interesting answer that ties it in with whatever else I can think of. But most of tonight is improvised. Now, as you said, I wrote a piece for pipe organ, and organists like to improvise. Well, also lecturers like to improvise, and so I'm going to try to respond to what you say. Now, I want to know, first of all, how many of you were not here last night? Were not at the lecture last night? So that almost more than half. So I have to start over again with that. Okay. How many of you are students here at university? More than half. Okay. How many of you are not students at university? More than half. That's amazing. Okay. How many of you never raise your hand? More than half. No. Okay. Well, okay. Okay. How many of you have never heard a bad joke? Now, I'm not sure what kind of. I haven't lectured in this room before, and so I'm not sure what kind of technology I have available to respond to questions. So, depending on the questions, I'll try to figure out. I found, I have a marker there, and so maybe I'll go and mark something on the board, and then they'll pull the screen out. But there's also a machine sitting there which is able to take pictures of things and show you what I have. So now I'm expecting that a lot of the questions will be about music tonight, because that's one of the things that I've stressed in my lecture last night. This experience that I had over the past years, writing a piece of music that I've been dreaming about doing for more than 50 years. And I have with me the score, all the notes, and so maybe some of your questions you'll want to, the best answer will be to show you a little bit of the real music, and if that comes up, then there's a way that I could project it. On the other hand, that might not be of any interest. Maybe you don't want to ask questions like that. So anyway, I have this as a possible resource. Now the actual title that the committee chose for this night is constraints as a source of inspiration. And the idea is the University of Waterloo is famous as a center of innovation and creativity, new ideas. And so in order to create something, you need to be inspired. And so, and also when you're writing music, you got to be inspired. So I want to say first, before we get to the question, just a few words about why constraints are wonderful. Make your creative juices flow. In the first place, let's take movies for example. In the old days, people made silent movies, and they were in black and white. And then people discovered Technicolor, and they discovered microphones, and and finally we got movies got fewer. The actors didn't have to weren't subject to so many restrictions. The cameras could sit anywhere, and so on. But movie directors, when sound came out and when color came out, they were almost unanimously upset about it because they had learned how to live with those constraints, and that they had brought a great art form for how to tell a story without sound, without color and so on. Now. We have, for example, in California, you come to live in California, you have to choose between 20 different lifestyles. We have students coming out to Stanford that have lived in a small village, and they might have had to make a choice between 2 different lifestyles. They come to California, now there's no constraints. And some of them, it really ruins their life because they're worried every day they aren't making the right choice because there's too many choices to make. So having only a limited number of possibilities is actually, believe it or not, an advantage. A very in computer science example, people work with robotics, and the early robots had 3 or 4, they were mechanical arms that had 3 or 4 degrees of freedom, they call it. And so people wrote computer programs that would figure out how to make the arm move and do certain things. And it would look at those 4 degrees of freedom, and it would figure out the best path for the arm to take. So then people improved the arm until finally, you had 12 degrees of freedom. All of a sudden, the computer programs couldn't do a thing. There were too many things to control. They couldn't find, the only way to write a program for the robot with 12 degrees of freedom was to pretend it only had 4 degrees of freedom. And so they had to devise a whole new approach to controlling robots. Okay, so having a lot of freedom is, in fact, not always a win. And it occurs all you can easily imagine. For example, writing poetry, people they get motivated if you say write a sonnet. You got to write 14 lines with a certain scheme, or even better, haiku. So what is the good haiku? It says. First line 5, second line 7, third line 5, and so haiku is 5 syllables and then 7 syllables and then 5 syllables. Okay, so when you're supposed to write a haiku, it sharpens your mind, and my wife has made some really incredibly beautiful haiku. But if I said to her, write some beautiful words. Without constraints, that wouldn't get her excited about doing it. Okay, so you get the idea that constraints help, and this was especially true, then when I sort of had a lifelong dream of writing music that would be inspiring to some people and positive influence on some people, and the reason that I thought it might be possible was because I thought of a series of constraints that would actually not only help me writing the music because I had something, I had a problem that I knew how. I mean, I had a concrete problem to resolve each day as I'm writing the music, but also because the constraints represented something I thought ought to be done. It started when I was a graduate student more than 50 years ago, and I saw that the Book of Revelation involved a wonderful pattern of symbolic things, numbers, and other things like angels and demons and lamb and candlesticks and all kinds of symbolic elements, all put together into a story that has inspired people for almost 2,000 years now, and it seemed to me it was just crying out to be translated into music, so that the music would use those same elementary concepts and symbols in the same order, but that would be constraints on the music, and I'll try to make that exactly clear what I mean. But so that meant that I could sit down and I faced with a part of the Book of Revelation that I want to convert into music, and my constraints will say, oh yeah, now you want to use staccato and maybe a trill, and then make a reference to Bach. And so for each verse I have maybe a dozen constraints, and I can't satisfy them all. I was inspired by a wonderful book by Georges Perec called La Vie, Mode d'Emploi, Life, a User's Manual, where this book is a book with 100 chapters, and in each chapter he had 43 constraints. It takes place in a building in Paris that has 100 rooms. And so one of the constraints is that this is about a certain room in this building, the building with 10 floors and so on. And the constraints are about occupations and various other things. And he had a very systematic 43 constraints. And I consider it one of the most brilliant novels ever written. Life, a User's Manual was also translated into English following the same constraints. And one of Perec's constraints was, one of the 43 was ignore one of the others. So you have a choice of which one to ignore as well. But in fact, instead of 100 chapters, it really only has 99 chapters. But extremely brilliant book. But he would never have written anything like it without the constraints. So I have the same situation where I felt actually called to write a piece that I wanted to translate the ancient Greek text of the Book of Revelation into music. And as I explained last night, I identified 167 elements among the 10,000 words, and I followed the order in which those things occur, and besides that, I knew that almost 100 composers had written wonderful music based on various individual verses of Revelation, and so I also wanted to pay homage, make a nod to much of this excellent music. So that's why we're putting up a keyboard here, so I can answer questions that have to do with music. All right, now, but I've been talking too much, so I gotta see if anybody can start the ball rolling with some questions. Please come to the front, or else shout it out, and I'll repeat.
Okay, I have a question. Is this audible? I have a question about Homo...
Yes, the answer is yes.
Okay. I have a question about Homo sapiens.
Homo sapiens.
Should the population be controlled or constrained? And should the duration be controlled or constrained? And if so, under what conditions?
Are you saying that should we limit everybody to a certain number of years of life?
Well, the total population, is there a limit?
I see.
Both to the number of people on the world, and is there a duration for our species that we should try and constrain or is constrained?
I see. Okay. Well, that's certainly one of the questions that I didn't expect. And I guess I promised to answer any question, but I don't promise to give the right answer. So I found it interesting once that some biologists argued that somehow death was somehow out of Darwin's theory, biology had invented death, even though Darwin is talking about survival of the fittest. It was somehow better to die or something like this. Well, it is hard for me to believe, but certainly there is a question of sustainability, and we can see how. What happens to insects? You asked about Homo sapiens, but certainly there's lots of other species, and we see somehow that it seems to be God's plan for some animals to eat other animals and things like that, and to keep control of populations. But I don't know how. But every time we try to apply logic to what to do with people, we seem to make mistakes. We say, okay, now we're only going to breed good people to good people, or we're going to decide that some people are worthless compared to others, and so on, or we're going to decide that everybody is exactly the same, and all these ideas turn out to be wrong. So my main answer is then that I don't have an answer. But I know it's a great question. Okay.
Hi, this is a combination of comments and questions. There's two questions buried in here. First of all, it's an honor to be in the presence of a certifiable genius, so I can check that off my bucket list. So I appreciate that. Appreciate your presence and your work. The first thing is I didn't realize, this is based on the topic tonight. I didn't realize till I did my master's that there's actually people who study creativity. And one of the findings is that there's the two best sources of creativity are total relaxation and leisure and unbelievable amounts of stress. They say that there's
leisure is one and stress is the other.
And they say that there's army doctors who are confronted with an injured soldier, and they say, I performed surgery on that guy, that if I'd had all the resources and all the time in the world, I couldn't have been as creative and clever in saving his life as I was, because I knew that if I didn't do something, he was dead.
That was the constraint of time, and they didn't have time to sit down and research it.
Right. Yeah. Well, and it seems that this will make more sense to people who saw your talk last night, but it seems that you sort of, when you decided you wanted to turn the Book of Revelation into music, that every time you come to a roadblock, a sort of, I'm not sure how to get past here, like when you gave the example of coming up with musical annotations for sort of earth, air, fire, water, that you turn to the I Ching. And that was sort of like, well, I've got it, this is stopping me from getting to my 167, so I've got to come up with a solution, and so then that's what you...
Well, I looked for for a variety of different motifs instead of getting stuck in the same way. And the I Ching was something that actually, another mystical book which comes from another culture, but had been also a source of inspiration. So that was part of it as well. Yeah.
The other question is, the impression I got from last night was that if you take the 167 symbols and then you sort of, they recur through the book, that in a sense what you're doing is creating a musical rebus. Like a rebus is a kid's book where instead of words you put little pictures. So in a sense you've turned the book of Revelation into a musical rebus where the symbols are translated into music. But presumably it's not just that. It wasn't just taking the 167 symbols, then seeing how they pan out through the book, and then just having the music going with that.
Exactly. These were the constraints, but there was another overriding constraint saying, I want it to be good music. I want it to be something that when I'm swimming, I can be humming. And instead of just being mechanical, it just helped me separate out all the things I didn't want to write, but it didn't tell me what to write. Now a couple of things. First of all, let's see. You mentioned about stress. A lot of I have to mention that in my own life, probably the most creative year of my life was the year that I was in most stress. I had 2 children that were 1 and 2 years old. I was editing more than a dozen journals. I was writing. I thought I could finish The Art of Computer Programming much sooner than I did, I got ulcers, but that same year I got 3 ideas that turned out to become some subfields of computer science, and many people's career based on the things that I thought of during that time. So it was obviously not a sustainable situation, but I came to the conclusion that if I wanted to start a research center where I was going to get important new ideas for computer science or other field, the best way would be to sort of torture all the people and make sure that they didn't get much sleep and so. As opposed to to providing everybody with a private masseur and swimming pool and so on, you probably get no theorems at all. Okay, so okay now then it also what helped me in my musical piece was that I not only had the 167 motifs, but I also had the allusions to other music. And so let me see how this keyboard works. Yeah. Okay. So one of the first things that I thought of in the early days was a phrase that occurs several times in the Book of Revelation. I am Alpha and Omega. This, Alpha is the first letter of the Greek alphabet. Omega is the last letter of the Greek alphabet, and so it's the beginning and the end, and God is. Jesus is self-describing himself as being Alpha and Omega. And I took a class in music theory when I was in Princeton in the 60s, and one of the exercises for the class was take a text and set it to music. And the text I chose for that exercise was I am Alpha and Omega. So I know that already when I was at Princeton, I was thinking of writing a piece based on the Book of Revelation someday, and so that was my first exercise, and so I I still have the answer I made to that exercise. It wasn't very good at all. The professor, he gave me a B on it, but he said it reminded him of a beautiful setting of I Am Alpha and Omega by Sir John Stainer. And he sang it for me. He said, I am Alpha and Omega. I believe that's about the way he sang it. And so it's not a really well-known piece, but of course, but I found it somewhere and made a Xerox copy of it. In fact, it was earlier than that. It was one of these copies that you had to make on a special chemical paper, and so it's all faded now. But I had that copy from the '60s of what Sir John Stainer wrote, and over the years I found other authors writing about this text, I Am Alpha and Omega, and I found it. So anyway, Sir John Stainer melody. Let's see. I think it comes. I think I get it in chapter 1. I get it in chapter 21 again. But here it is. Okay. Sorry. Okay. I am Alpha and Omega. Okay. So then I learned about another setting, which is modern by a composer named Tom Trice. And I'm thinking about the organ and being first and last. Well, I want to get across the idea of extremes, that God covers everything and so on an organ to be everything from high to low. So I wanted to have part of my Alpha and Omega be way up high, another part be way down low. And so, so anyway, Tom Trice's so I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Da 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 da. Okay, so that's Tom Trice. And so on the organ, I've got the pedal playing this part, and the right hand playing this. But in the left hand, I've got Stainer. So if you listen to the left hand, you had that Omega. So I found out as I'm writing the piece that Tom Trice from late 1900s, late 2000s, goes well with Stainer from the middle 1800s, and it also conveys the idea of God as covering all, and so that's the kind of thing that I'm looking for when I'm talking about constraint, but not just making a rebus, if you understand that. Okay. Hi.
Last night you mentioned that you had originally narrowed it down to about 250 words, and then from there you said that was too much, so then you went down to your 167. Yeah. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about whether you had a methodology for doing that narrowing down from 250 to 167.
Yeah, so I got the 250 by reading through the whole story a few times. I went through and I said, oh yeah, here's, heaven is talked about here, an angel, and I wrote down a bunch of things. And actually I was, gosh, what's her name? She's a very prominent theologian. She had just written a book on Revelation, and she came to California to give a day of lectures, and I I'm a busy guy, so I went up and sat in the audience and listened to her lectures, but at the same time, I'm making my list. By going through Revelation actually and writing down these words. And so then I had a list of 250 things, and I found them all in Greek, and I found out that some of the things that I thought occurred throughout the text actually occurred only 4 or 5 times. And so it was mostly based on frequency. So I got to the point where I said, well, there's really no point in having a motif here because I'm not going to come back to it. So this now the piece when you hear it, it has a kind of a different. I call it high bandwidth music. That is, it doesn't. It has a lot of ideas per second in a sense, take Mahler's symphony for example. Mahler usually gives you 5 new ideas on every page, more than other composers tend to do, but high bandwidth in the sense that it doesn't. That you don't get it the first time, and I was reacting against a lot of the modern music that I've heard that was heard by. I mean, Stanford has Karma, which is a great center for computer, what is it, CRMA, anyway, music and acoustics, but they have great contemporary musicians, and they make new sounds electronically in really exciting ways, and it's moving through space and things very thrilling, but it tended to be episodic. The composer would find a new effect and would dwell on it until the audience got it, and then would move to the next effect and play that until everybody got the point. And so you would go and you would hear one really nice episode after another, but you always understood it. On the other hand, Mozart and Beethoven and so on, it's not that they kept hitting you with something. You hear the piece again, and you hear something else, and so I maybe went overboard the other way, and I said I don't care to wait until the audience gets something, but I want to have music that somehow is stimulating to our brain, but not because we understand it, and that as we hear it more, then it means more to us, and we grow with it. Now, this is obviously going to work for some people better than others, but I found with this idea of the motifs that in fact, instead of having an ABAB type of structure, which is one very common kind of constraint and works very well, sonata form, everybody loves it. But in this case, when we hear musical idioms coming back, that also triggers our brain in another way. And so to musicians, love it when Tchaikovsky comes back to a theme in the 4th movement that he used in a slightly different way in the 1st movement and the 2nd movement. And so in this way, as you go through the piece, and all of a sudden you hear the lamb bleeding, this means more to you as you keep hearing it. So I'm trying to explain some of the way that the constraints also made me think about the whole thing. But the overall thing was it had to be good music. I could write a computer program that would generate music, and some parts of the piece are are done by algorithm. For example, there's one place where the saints come marching in. I guess that's chapter 7. So the Book of Revelation says there are 144,000 saints coming in. And so they come in 12 groups of 12,000. And so there's the organ at this point plays on the pedal. And then it plays permutations each permutation ends with this note, but there's 50 notes in front of it. And so mathematicians love permutations, and there are 15 factorial permutations. But anyway, but one of my first students was Michael Ashbacher, who's the foremost group theorist in the world. So I wrote to Michael and said, what's the most interesting group on 15 elements that has 12,000 elements to it? And so he told me about a very nice group. And so if you so actually this music you could have played it 12,000 times. Each time the pedal would have played a different thing. And in the piece, I only go through the first 6 of those, and then later on you hear the last one. But mathematically, this connotes 144,000 because we had 12. Each tribe gets to do it. But if that hadn't sounded good, then I wouldn't have done it. In fact, you'll hear the organist also plays in the left hand a few times. That's when all the saints come marching in. Okay, that's a reference to saints marching in. But then the saints themselves, first comes Reuben. Now this is the name Reuben expressed in Hebrew Morse code. So the rhythm is dot dot dash dot 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 dot. Okay, so now I wanted to somehow give the name Reuben, and the same for Simeon and Levi and the other. And it turned out that by going up between dots and dashes and using the rhythm of dots and dashes, it made music. And if I didn't like the music, then I would then I threw it out. But in this case, I actually bought it, and so I could imagine that these saints are marching along, singing their tribal song. And Reuben's song is da 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 da. Okay, now there's another place at the end where it talks about the jewels in New Jerusalem, and they have jasper and various emeralds and so on, and there I used a similar thing based on Greek names for the jewels, but also a musical thing that would make it sound like Gregorian chant in a way. And so again, that was something that happened to work. It sounded almost like an authentic Gregorian chant, but it was really spelling the names of the minerals. And I think that reflects somehow when you read the Book of Revelation, the author actually was stressing the 12,000 saints. The number obviously fascinated the author, and the same all those jewels in the New Jerusalem was something that the author he wouldn't have had to name them all and dwell on them, but that was a fascinating thing. So I wanted to express that musically.
I was just wondering if there was a backstory behind the infrequently asked questions page and also the do not click here link on your website.
Okay.
Thank you.
Is there a backstory between my? I have my website. Was done in raw HTML when HTML was brand new, and in those days we had all kinds of feature. Maybe they're still supported, but you could make text blinking and things like this. But it was before ads but one of the things that we had in those days was counters as to how many times a person visited a page, and Stanford's Apache server no longer supports those counters. But in the early days, I wanted to know how many people would click on a link that said "Don't click here," and I got to use it all as I had to do experiment. I had to figure out what does this do in HTML, and the manuals were pretty bad, so I would try stuff, and then I would so I had to have a place where I could click too. But I remembered those were my clicks. So that's kind of the backstory of that. So did you click on that? Yes, you must have. Yeah. Okay. Well, see, I don't know it anymore.
What about the infrequently asked questions?
What now?
What about the infrequently asked questions on that?
What was what?
You have a link for frequently asked questions?
Oh, frequently asked questions. Yes. Oh, yeah. So in the early days, when home pages were new, one of the things you often found on a person's home page said frequently asked questions, and this was great because I write books and I don't want to have to answer the same question over and over again, and so it's great that I could put the answer on the web once and for all, and then anybody asks me, I say, well, look at my FAQ page. Okay, but then the United States decided to invade Iraq, and I started going day after day and hearing that nobody was asking questions about that, and they were talking about. I go to swimming in the locker room. People are talking about something that had nothing to do with all of the lives my country was destroying in another part of the world, and I was disturbed that nobody was talking about those things, and why do we support? Why are we against the International Court of Justice? Various questions that I had. So I made a page called "Infrequently Asked Questions," which I found a lot of sympathy here and there, but I didn't make my page. I didn't put it in your face, but I didn't make my page very effective enough because I didn't get much hate mail from it. But thank you for thank you for your interest. A lot of people have said they were glad to see the infrequently asked question, and it's include there a reference to a wonderful speech that Richard Weizsäcker gave on behalf of the German nation after Hitler time, and also some references to the book by Thomas Mann, Dr. Faustus, which actually has to do with music, but Thomas Mann wrote these words in 1945 as the last the bombs were falling all over Germany, and his fatherland had been he still wanted to be proud of his country. But so anyway, it's very. These are the kind of questions that I thought ought to be asked, so thanks for bringing that up.
A lot of times during classes, during my studies, I was able to, when someone mentioned something and didn't know the answer, I was able to quickly look up something on the internet, and I was able to do that here tonight regarding yourself, but I've never had the opportunity to personally thank the person who enabled me to do that. So thank you very much. My main question is, talking about constraints, just looking at what you've been able to accomplish, it's mind-blowing, not just in computer science and mathematics, but also in music, and I presume other areas as well. Just wondering, for us here, and speaking personally as another Christian, what are some constraints that we might be able to put on our lives in order for us to make the most out of our lives and live them to the full?
So I guess they're called the Ten Commandments. I should mention that, well, it's not good to extrapolate that the fact that I know X and Y doesn't mean that I know Z. But I guess sometime tonight I wanted to recommend for people like you that you might enjoy if you don't know about it already, the transcripts of the lectures that I gave at MIT 20 years ago. And so there's a book called Things a Computer Scientist Rarely Talks About. And at MIT I was asked to give a series of 6 public lectures every Wednesday night for a month and a half, dealing with faith and science, and those lectures were almost, more than half of the lectures were question answers like this, and people from all different religious persuasions in Boston were there, and we had some really interesting discussions, and it's all recorded on that in that book. And so if you haven't heard about the book, that's got my best answers to these questions. Okay.
So my question is whether you discovered any new theological insights or interesting insights that weren't already in the research that you did prior to doing this. And did you discover any new insights through this process that weren't already in the research that you did? And if not, what was the most interesting thing you discovered in the research?
Okay, well, the most interesting, I'm never able to remember the most interesting things usually, but certainly as I read all of these commentaries, the things that would fall into place would keep occurring, but I'm not sure what stands out the most. One of the somehow it's the whole rather than the parts almost nobody has ever read the book of Revelation from the beginning to end. People do Bible studies of it, but they start and they focus on one part, and they don't go through the whole thing in sequence. And so I guess we were talking about this last night, that there's a great sequence of 24 videos, hour-long videos about Revelation, where illustrated beautifully and going into it, but really leaves out about 7 of the chapters. And really, and so when I'm writing this piece, of course, I'm not leaving out 7 of the chapters. Previously, there was one major work based on Revelation, a magnificent oratorio by Franz Schmidt. It's extremely well known in Austria. I hadn't heard about it until I visited Vienna and talked to people there. But now Jan, the organist, had the privilege of playing the organ in a performance as one of the highlights of his life of Franz Schmidt's work on the 7 seals, Sieben Siegel, but still, that's only 1/3 of the Book of Revelation. And so I had Franz Schmidt's entire score, and I looked at each of the parts that interacted with Revelation, but it covered only part. So somehow the totality of it, seeing the whole the whole milieu from beginning to end without sort of at the same tempo as it was originally written was something that I think has been underemphasized, and I'm hoping that people who experience my piece aren't only going to play chapter 1 or some. I mean, although I love to hear chapter 18. I mean, but having all 22 chapters, and it lasts an hour and a half. Well, big chunk of time, but I think that's where you get the most out of it is by seeing sort of an integrative experience rather than focusing on a particular. Of course, I couldn't write it that way. The way I actually wrote it was inside out. I started in chapter 16. I figured chapter 16, sort of in the middle, I can make mistakes. Nobody will notice. And the parts that last night I played out of chapter 2. I had to write chapter 2 rather late in the game because I needed almost all the motifs by that time. So I had to get motifs one at a time. But I did the part about the horses early on. But then there was a point where I had every 3rd chapter written, and then I filled in the ones that were congruent to 2 mod 3. I mean, going one at a time, and I left chapter 1 to the end. Computer programmers will know that you often leave the initialization to last. And also the final chapters. That meant that I had to try to keep the whole in context. When you're writing, one of the constraints also is that you don't want everything loud. For 5 minutes, you want variety. The human ears need rest. You need pauses. You need not only notes, and so all of this context is another hidden constraint on the outside. Over. Yeah, I've been a right winger here. I've got to go to the left here.
You seem to have a lot of experience in music and fields other than computer science. So what brought you into computer science? Why did you decide to major in computer science?
Why did I decide to major in computer science? It's very simple. It was one thing I was good at. I mean, there were other things that I didn't resonate with, but for somehow I had been, at least by the time I met a computer, my brain had somehow organized itself in a way that meant that computer programs seemed instantly right for me. I mean, to the point where I was a freshman in college, And I looked at the manuals for the computers at that time, and the manual was just atrocious. And the manual said, here's how to do something, and it was stupid. And I said, well, I'm not just a freshman. I know a better way to do that than here's this book. And so maybe that should be my career. Yeah. Thanks, because I really think that's what brings people into computer science. It's not that they say computation is the most important human activity. Computer science, I think, is a skill-driven thing where people who have somehow grown up to have the set of skills that makes them understand computers draws them to it, and it's the same for many other people. But medicine is a different thing. Medicine is a goal-driven activity where you say, I want to help people see, and so then they use whatever skills they have adapted to that. But in the case of computer science, it's that I just happen to find something that I have a skill that makes it good, and then I can apply this to various purposes. But I didn't go into computer science because of the purpose, but because of the fact that I happen to be good at it.
Reflecting on your many accomplishments, how much would you ascribe to hard work or innate ability or even just luck and chance? So 99% perspiration and 1% is, no, I love long attention span and concentrating on something. And I guess I was like that when I was 1 year old. At Christmas time, I would play with the first toy, and wouldn't open the other ones yet. And in my math classes, I loved chapter 1. Seriously. No more left wingers here. You got a complicated question.
So the concept of constraints as source of inspiration is actually, it's the first time I've heard in my life. Like, it's actually pretty new concept to me, and to an extent, I can see why that's the case. But the question I want to ask is that, how would you answer questions who say, no, it's the freedom that gives you source of inspiration. It's the freedom that allows us to be more creative. It's the what? The freedom.
The freedom.
So how would you answer those people?
Well, I just don't believe it. Look, I met a lot of artists, like sculptors, in Eastern Europe before the fall of the Iron Curtain, and they were doing all kind of creative stuff, and then all of a sudden they had freedom, and they hadn't done anything for 10 years. This was they were inspired because of their adversity to do something. So I'm sure it must be possible to do creative work when somebody gives you carte blanche and says, okay, now do anything you want. But it certainly wouldn't work for me.
Good evening, Professor.
Don.
Well, thank you. Your work has enabled others to create a lot of value, as in trillions of dollars of value in companies, mostly software companies. Have you ever felt that you wish you captured some of that value monetarily? If you have, how?
I don't disapprove of people who, enjoying money, but I've never understood it myself. I mean, you know, people ask me to be a consultant. I'll be happy to consult on anything that, except money. I don't understand money. The thing if anything about computer science that I agonize over, it's that people rate my work by how much it affects Wall Street, rather than how interesting it is, or you know, how useful it is. So it's never. Somebody said once that if I received, you know, 1 nanopenny for every time it's like somebody used one of my algorithms, you know, I would be the richest person in the world. Well, that's obviously an exaggeration, but anyway, it never occurred to me that doing this that it was that it had a monetary impact. It's true that my books bring in royalties like an oil well, so I had a comfortable life. And I was able to, for example, help our church get a very fine pipe organ because of the royalties. If you look in my book in the index under royalties, comma, use of, you'll find a picture of organ pipes. You know, but a lot of my friends have started up important companies and they're changing the world in great ways, and that's fine. But it's just not. But in my own case, I was born to be a teacher and explain to things, and so that's what turns me on is seeing people light dawn in their eyes, and then they're inspired to do something. You know, I'm glad to, like somebody mentioned, being able to use Google or something like that. So one of my students, you know, invented the search technology of Alta Vista in the early days, and that was taken over later by Google and other. So you know, I'm really happy that I was able to teach that person something. But it wasn't. I don't deserve that much credit, really. But I just, you know, came along at the right time in the history of the world. Yeah. That's a good algorithm. I'll move back and forth. It could.
What do you think are the 5 most important or influential discoveries in computer science so far? And can you maybe comment on how constraints played a role in that?
How constraints play a role? Okay, the 5 most important. Boy, I'm sorry. You know, what are Mozart's top 5 compositions? Well, how would I do this? You know, for algorithms, you know, I used to think I could never say what was my favorite algorithm or number 1 algorithm, but it occurred to me that there's a certain algorithm by Bob Tarjan, an algorithm for the technical term is the strong components of a directed graph, and Tarjan's algorithm for strong components, I think, is the most beautiful algorithm that I know, and I was pleased to. Well, I haven't gotten to it yet in the art of computer programming, but I have a book called the Stanford Graph Base, which has 12 pages for each of 30 different algorithms, and the most fun 12 pages in that book were about Tarjan's method for strong components, and it solves lots of other problems, but it's also just beautiful in itself, the ideas as they go. So what constraints was he under when he developed the algorithm? Well, he saw that that this was important. So anyway, strong components are. I better explain what it is. You have a directed graph, which means you have points, vertices that each point to another thing. And then if something points to another and points to another and comes back into a circle, everything in a strong component are the things that from which you can get from one to another all the time. So we take any directed graph and you can break it into strong components. And in between the strong components are things that one precedes another. And so some are at the beginning and they don't depend on anything else. But then you have other strong components that get their inputs from this, and then there are some at the end that have no successors. And Tarjan found a way to look at a graph, and in linear time, which means to the minimum possible amount of work, you look at every part of the directed graph only once or twice, and you figure out what the strong components are. And so his constraint was really to find a way to do that in linear time. And in order to do that, he had to figure out a way to keep track of exactly the right things and find it's harder than exploring a cave, but he figured out a great way to do it. And so that, at least I didn't do 5 for you, so his constraint was elegance, time, to solve a problem that he knew was worth solving. And so I suppose if I could come up with 4 more, it would be also, my favorite things would be algorithms. Other people would say networking ideas or something like that. But when we're writing papers, we're always looking for something that we learn, and then we want to explain to somebody else what we learned, so that they can run with it too.
So I really don't know anything about computer programming. I don't know anything about computer programming, but I was wondering, what has computer programming taught you about God or about your faith? Was there something in your work that sort of revealed something to you about God?
Yeah, right. So that's an excellent question. I told you about my lectures at MIT, and there were 6 lectures, and the last of those was God and computer science, and so it sort of was focusing on what physicists have talked about, how their knowledge of physics helped them understand aspects of God, and chemists and so on. And so this was my take on it as a computer scientist, and so there are some things where maybe computers. So when we're writing computer programs, we're creating universes in a way. We don't have. A physicist has to follow the laws of gravity and Newton's other laws and so on. But computer scientists don't. We can make up our own rules, and each computer program you could say is a design of some man-made universe. All right. So anyway, we have some ideas of what it feels like to be a creator of a universe, and so we can, so then we say, well, how would we, for example, what would it mean that we could somehow enter into that universe? So these are questions that a computer programmer can maybe think about a little more. But there's also multiverse. So there's these concepts about maybe our universe is really infinitely many universes that keep branching off all the time. And today I'm giving a lecture in this universe, but tomorrow there will be 300 other, the rest of this lecture will go many different ways in different multiple copies of this universe. How do we know? There's no way for us to know which is actually true. Physicists might say that all of these universes, they all satisfy the same differential equations, and there's many solutions to those differential equations. Because of Heisenberg and various things. So all of these universes might exist. And, in some of them, Fantasia Apocalyptica is much more beautiful than the others, and so on. Okay, but anyway, with understanding of programming, you get to be a little more familiar with that territory of multiple things. Not that it means that I feel confident that I know the answers, but I feel that it helps me to understand a little bit more. Okay. How about this side?
So hi, good evening. So for a very long time, when I was younger, for a long time when I was younger, I've believed that people who are religious are inherently intellectually inferior at some point. I'm obviously working on that, and I have this feeling of conflict of having academics like science and math and unite having that exist side by side with my also religious beliefs. And I think that your work is a very interesting is very interesting in a way that you're using your mathematical skills to incorporate you incorporate those with something from the Bible. I was wondering if you've also experienced that kind of conflict when you were starting to study in academia, or from your many years of academia, have you encountered similar sentiments?
Yeah. Well, okay. So I don't believe that God only wants college professors to get into heaven, but nor does he only want children or people who are not intellectual. But I think it's for everyone, and many intellectuals feel that what they hear on the radio or something, the people who are religious are also closed-minded and or believe everything is black and white, and I'm sorry that they got that stereotype, and so but so what? I mean, everything. Religion, whatever you talk about, people have the wrong stereotype about it. I mean, nobody ever understands anything the same way or correctly. So, what other people think about it, you can help them understand their blind spots, but it doesn't. I'm more interested in how I should act rather than what other people think about my actions. And I was always glad that well, okay, I'm raised as a Lutheran. Martin Luther was intellectual. He did widely reading of everything. He kept. He didn't turn off his brain, in order to be a good Christian. I was. I'm trying to remember the name of the person who said he was so glad that the doors of churches aren't so low that you have to leave your head behind when you go in. Okay, so.
Hi, Professor Dong. I want to ask a question. Like, I actually study saxophone, but I quit it because I want to focus on my study and my other things in life. So, like, how can music benefit your academic results? Like for example, like computer programming. Like, what kind of ability you can develop from learning music to study computer programming? Is it like, for example, imagination or memory, or the way your hands interconnected with your brain to operate musical instruments? Thank you.
I guess I can type faster. My experience at a keyboard, I can really use Emacs, all the control keys. But for me, it actually goes the other way. I've always found that the knowledge of computer science allows me to understand almost any other field. And here's the reason. People have said for years that you never really understand something until you teach it to somebody else. But in fact, you never really understand something until you teach it to a computer. Because when you're teaching it to somebody else, that person nods their head, and and then you go on. But the computer doesn't nod its head. In order to teach a computer, you have to understand everything. And so that forces you to realize what you don't know. And so it's a really good teacher. The idea of so as I'm trying to learn about musical composition, I'm trying to say, how would I teach a computer to decide whether something is more beautiful than something else? And I would never maybe teach the computer about a Petrushka chord, though somehow I'd have to build in some machine learning, some deep learning, have the computer listen to Stravinsky. But anyway, this whole idea of having algorithm as a model of reality forces precision of thinking that nothing else can match. We go to this side. Oh, here we are. I thought maybe you were walking out. No.
No, I wouldn't dare. Someone really important to me taught me a lot of really important lessons throughout the past couple of years of my life. One thing he said is that we're losing our sense of absolutes right now in the world. Like, for example, in a religious context, we always know the difference between good and bad and how to express that. And then he suggested that that's really being called into question right now. And you could see that with things like autonomous driving, where people don't know what the right decision would to be, steer off and hurt one person or, save a child or whatever. But where do you think that lies right now? Where are absolutes?
Well, I think it's true that for some reason people are saying that expertise is wrong. Facts don't matter. The only thing that matters is whether you have a credential rather than whether you know anything about anything, or or whether you have. Anyway, all of these. If you talk about the 7 deadly sins, I think the president of my country he spends most of his time doing 6 of the 7. Sloth I haven't been able to get, but okay. So that's a kind of absolute and to find it's astonishing to me that people think that this is politics rather than fundamental humanity, and so I those kind of absolutes I certainly see scary in a way, but I'm not totally a pessimist because let's think of how many things are actually going right. So I don't know how to express this very well, but we have something we call civilization, and these are things that were added that aren't part of nature, but something that over centuries people have contributed. God gave us these abilities, and so we have invented microphones, we have invented languages, we've invented jackets, we've invented, everywhere you look, you see all kinds of things, all of the words in our language. So there are billions and billions of things that aren't part of nature that came about because of civilization. Now, it would be impossible if we got everything right. It's amazing that we only have 1,000 bad things right now to worry about, in a way, because there are so many things that we take for granted that actually had to be worked out over time. And so anyway, I'm not a total pessimist, but we are definitely have to always keep watching that we don't take too many steps backward. Yeah.
Previously, a question was asked about how through computer science someone can understand God. My question is a bit similar in the sense that I would like to know how through computer science you have personally come to know God or experienced some revelation about Him, or just experienced Him in any way that impacted your faith.
So in my case, of course, it was, I grew up in a loving family that had, and we didn't know anybody who didn't share our faith. And we didn't, we heard about the Catholics, but we weren't taught to hate them either. But we didn't know, there were, I grew up in an interesting, nice bubble, but I wasn't taught that other people were, that there was anything else. And then, so as far as computers go, I suppose the most relevant thing is that I always, it was always part of my understanding that God knows everything I'm thinking. It's not, I only learned much later that other people have an idea of privacy. But for me, everything I did, everything I actually thought was actually sort of public knowledge in the sense that God knew it. Okay, so that has been a strong aspect of my life all the way through, that I never that I never thought of hiding my thoughts in some way. And that means that I'm not any good at working on crypto, for cryptography, because I'm not sneaky enough to figure out, what the enemy is going to do. So this, that's my first take on that question.
Thank you.
I have one kind of more philosophical question, I guess, and sort of kind of put them at odds with each other. But what do you think is more valuable for humanity? Computers and its superset technology, or music and its superset art? Sorry, it's a bit of a broad question, but.
Okay, well, let's hope we don't have to make that choice. Right. Now, are apples or oranges better? It's vive la différence, and let's try to blend. And so actually, I'm looking to a future where people consider that their role is not to be part of. Okay, people here, Waterloo is strong in graph theory. I talked about directed graphs a minute ago. So anyway, so historically, people identified themselves with vertices, which, in other words, there's a computer scientist, there's a mathematician, there's a chemist, and so on. But I'm thinking that the world is changing so that people identify themselves with edges, with arcs, connections between vertices. So everybody is somehow a bridge between two different specialties, and their role is to help transmit the qualities back and forth across these bridges. And so that I think is a way of looking at the change that we're going through as more and more knowledge is accumulated.
I know I already asked a question. How long will it be before a computer, like not a person using a computer, but a computer creates Fantasia Apocalyptica 2.0, and will it be any good?
Okay, well, I would say about 138 years, and it will be terrible. I'm not good at predicting the future. The interviewer once asked me, Don, over your career, what is the most surprising thing that happened? That happened immediately. I rattled off several dozen things that really surprised me through, and then her next question was, what was the least surprising thing? In other words, what would you have predicted correctly? And I was stumped. I sat there for 5 minutes. I couldn't think of a thing.
Hello. One question on faith again. To what extent would you say that prayer and your faith guided the writing of your musical piece and the choosing the motifs?
Okay, so it's interesting that prayer isn't mentioned, as far as I know, in the book of Of course, no one book is a complete theology. But there is the concept of smoke going up to heaven, and that those were the prayers of the believers. Incense and smoke appear in connection with, but mostly the worship at that time was prostration. Prayer is conversation with God, and so it sort of takes place. It just represents that kind of personal communication. But I don't think it was stressed particularly in that music. I did want, though, how to for the smoke effect. I tried to get what's called a, gosh, I can't think of the technical term now, a something tone. It sounds like it's always rising, but it's also standing still. I mean, it keeps rising and rising and rising and rising and rising. A something tone. The guy in the 30s who came up, anyway, and so we have a sort of that in the effect, because I wanted to have this effect that that there is this communication with God. But,
sort of as a clarification, when you came upon roadblocks when writing your piece, or perhaps in your computer science career, would you then turn to God and maybe pray and ask for guidance, or would you be using that as?
Oh yeah, I mean, I felt all the way. I felt somehow a calling that I was supposed to do this, and I wanted to carry it out, responsibly and somehow not mess it up, and so I would, and so I would always, look for an indication that I was on the right track, and so, but it wasn't specifically that I had a particular time I sat down and did it, but it would just be like while I'm swimming or something that I would, I would say, like, let's hope this, this is this result. But the somehow it was as if there was something telling me what to write. I didn't feel blocked. I didn't feel that it would. I felt like, as I said last night, that I had to listen for. I had to listen for it, but that it was already out there, and I can't account for it. But in fact, that's the way it worked. I have to also mention that because of that, it was very hard on my wife. Because as I'm listening for it, I'm trying to play what I thought it should be, I would be playing awful stuff, and she's just sitting in the other room trying to get work done, and I'm over here at the organ and piano, and making, but then as soon as I get it and write it down, then I move to the next, and so she never gets to hear the good stuff. And so the fact is, the last weekend when I knew I was going to finish the piece, she rented a hotel room in town and left me the house for 3 days to finish the piece. But it was this process really of letting the music come to me that was involved, rather than specifically kneeling or something like this. But I did always think that that this is something that God wants me to do, and I'm going to try to do my best.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So I'm afraid I think our time is up. On behalf of the Pascal Committee members and the university, we're grateful for each one of you to have come this evening. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope you found it interesting, stimulating, and provocative in some way. I think we should thank Dr. Knuth one more time.